Today's gospel lesson is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, verses 41 through 44. And Jesus sat down opposite the treasury and watched the multitude putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums, and a poor widow came and put in 2 copper coins, which make up about a penny. And Jesus called his disciples to him, and he said to them, "Truly, I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury, for they all contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, her whole living." I first met Christopher about 10 years ago. He was an 8-year-old Native American boy living on a reservation in South Dakota. Christopher's family was not necessarily poor, but most of the people living on the reservation were. And Christopher's mom and dad owned a small business, and it was doing fairly well. One day, Christopher's mom was heading north to Fargo, where the closest large mall happened to be. And as she was about to go up there, Christopher's dad knew that Christopher was going to be going with her, and so he gave Christopher a $20 bill. That was more money than Christopher had ever held in his hand before. And Christopher treated it like a treasure. So they went up to Fargo shopping for the entire day. Well, it just so happened that the next day was Sunday. And they were sitting in church, and the father happened to notice during the offering that Christopher put a $20 bill in the offering plate. He was astounded. So after church, he said to Christopher, "Son, I couldn't help but notice that you put $20 in the offering plate. Was that the $20 bill that I gave to you to go shopping in Fargo with your mother yesterday?" And Christopher said, "Yeah, Dad, it is," as if it were nothing. And Christopher's dad asked him, "Well, Christopher, I gave that money to you to spend on whatever you wanted, and you chose to give it to the church offering. Why did you do that?" And Christopher said to his dad, "Well, Dad, as I looked around the shopping mall, I didn't see a single thing that I needed. And frankly, I knew that the church just needed that money a whole lot more than anything I could buy for myself." Well, Christopher's dad was so impressed. You see, the church was just at the time going through a capital campaign because it was basically falling apart all around them. And they knew that if they didn't raise a bunch of money to keep the building safe, they were going to have to close its doors in less than a year. And Christopher knew about this. And that night, when Christopher and the rest of the kids went to bed, his mom and dad talked about his offering, and how impressed and how literally astounded they both were that he gave all that he had to his church when he had permission to give all that money wherever and spend it however he wanted. So Christopher's mom and dad had a very intimate conversation that evening about money. And they asked themselves questions like, what would it be like if we gave with that same level of generosity, with that same kind of abandon that Christopher gave to the church? What would that be like for us? And they asked, is there really anything else we need that's more important than our church and its ministry on the reservation? And then they started talking about the church and the reservation and how important their church was and how important it was that their church stayed open, not just for several more months, but for many, many years, because that church was so important and made such a difference to to so many people. It was the only church for miles and miles around that provided ministry specifically for people on the reservation, for Native Americans. In fact, everybody that went to the church was either Native American or married to a Native American. So they had a very long conversation that evening, and then they talked about the prayer that their pastor had asked them to pray that went something like this: "Oh God, what do you want us to do to accomplish your will for our church?" And they took that prayer very seriously. And as it turned out, they made a pretty remarkable commitment themselves based upon what they saw in their 8-year-old son, Christopher. What they decided to do was to look at the actual goal that the entire church was going to try to raise to keep the doors open for a couple more years. And Christopher's mom and dad said, "We are going to commit to giving that entire amount ourselves." In other words, our family will give what's expected of the whole entire church, and we will use this as an example of stewardship and invite the whole rest of the church to at least double what our one family has done. It really was a remarkable commitment for this family to make. It wasn't an easy commitment, but they did so because they wanted to. And it all started with, imagine this, an 8-year-old boy with a $20 bill who gave it all to his church. And it's a remarkable story to me. It reminds me of another remarkable story, another remarkable person. And you've all heard this story before. It's the gospel lesson that I read to you just a few moments ago. The story about a poor widow who gave all that she had to her church, to the temple in Jerusalem. In order to understand just what a remarkable woman this was and how remarkable her story was at the time and still is, it's important to look at the context of the Gospel of Mark so that we can really understand what was going on, who she was, and who else was there, and why this made such a remarkable story. So let me just begin by telling you that the Gospel of Mark was written to the people about 12 to 15, less than 20 years after Jesus died and was resurrected. It was stories given to people in that time frame in order to teach a spiritual lesson. So, in order for us to really understand this story, we must ask ourselves, what might that spiritual lesson have been for the original readers of Mark's Gospel? And then hopefully we'll find a spiritual lesson for ourselves. So let's look a little bit more deeply at the context of Mark chapter 12. First of all, in Mark's Gospel, they were in Jerusalem. Jesus was there with his disciples, and they were at the temple. Now, the temple in Jerusalem was the place that represented God's presence. It was the place where people went to feel God's presence. It was where people went to give thanks for God's presence. Every person who could went to the temple to feel God's presence and to give thanks for it. The other thing that happened at the temple is that's where people gave their offerings and their sacrifices. Now, if you don't know this already, to understand the story, it's really important to know that out of all the religious things that a Jewish person could do at that time, going to the temple and giving an offering was the most important thing in that person's life. The most important religious act that that person could do. So you know where it was and you know what was going on. So who else was there? Well, Mark tells us earlier in the chapter, and in the chapter before that, that Jesus' audience was some of the most remarkable people in the country. In fact, Mark lists that there were the chief priests, the elders, the scribes, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Herodians. In other words, those who were of the household of King Herod. So let me just tell you that these were the most important political and religious figures in the entire country. Let me also tell you that they were the rich people, the richest of the rich. These were the people who were on the who's who list of Jerusalem and indeed of the whole country. So Mark wants to make it very, very clear that these were the people that were there. It's so important for him to know, for his audience to know that he lists every single group of these wealthy and significantly influential people that were there. And these people were known for giving very large sums to the offering. So we know where Jesus was with his disciples. We know also who was there. And now let's look at the context of the conversation that had been happening right before this morning's gospel lesson. Jesus was actually having a conversation with some of these religious and political leaders. And it's really clear in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus wasn't just preaching to them. He was having a conversation with them. And part of the conversation had to do with what was most important. Now keep in mind that the people that went to Jerusalem already knew that the most important thing you could do was to go to the temple and give as much as you could to the offering. Like I said earlier, that was the most important religious act that people did. And so one of the scribes said to Jesus, "What is the most important commandment?" I have no idea what he was expecting Jesus to say, but I'm pretty sure that he wasn't expecting Jesus to say, to love God with your entire being and to love your neighbor as yourself. Now the scribe who asked the question most likely was the scribe that responded when he said, "Jesus, you are absolutely right. This commandment is more important than all the rest put together." And Jesus agreed with him. Now, we have to understand what a profound statement about love that was in order to understand the real meaning of this morning's gospel lesson. So people came to Jerusalem thinking they were doing the most important thing. Whether you were rich or poor, that was the most important thing you could possibly do. And Jesus said, not at all. There's something way, way more important than that. And that is to love God with all your being and to love your neighbor as yourself. In fact, there's nothing more important than that. We have to understand just how profound that must have meant to the people who heard that. Especially the rich people. Well, let's start with them. Thinking as they approached the temple with a treasury, with their fancy gold coins, they must have thought they were doing the most important thing. And as they learned from Jesus, that wasn't it at all. And for the poorer people who came with their little tiny coins, maybe that wasn't the most important thing. But this really is a story about contrast, a remarkable contrast, and a remarkable love. You see, the contrast here, Mark paints a picture for his readers as clearly as possible. You've got the richest of the richest and the most influential people in the country, and they're all there. And then on the other hand, you've got one poor widow. You've got all these people with all their money, and over here you've got one poor widow. There is no greater contrast in that society in terms of people, socioeconomically speaking. It's a pretty big contrast. And then the other huge contrast that Mark paints for us is the contrast of the gifts that people gave. So the rich people could afford the gold Roman aureus, a big coin that was shiny that they could show people before they dropped it in the treasury. That's what they could give. But we're told the one poor widow had 2 copper coins. And the coin that she actually had was called a lepta. And the lepta was a tiny little copper coin. And it literally took thousands of them to make up the large gold coin. And notice the contrast, the rich people, the poorest of the poor. The gold aureus coin, the tiny little lepta that really was worth practically nothing. And then listen to what Jesus said. The one coin, or the 2 coins that she put in the treasury, this one woman, is worth more than all the rest that people put in. And then he told them the reason. He said, the people that are putting in all the large amounts of money are living lives of abundance, and they're just giving to God a small part of their abundance. But on the other hand, this one poor widow gave all that she had. All of her life is literally what it means. The word in the Greek in the New Testament is bios. And many translations say something like, she gave all that she had, her entire living, or all that she had to live on. But the actual word bios means life. It means living. It's the word that we get biology from, the study of living things. This lady gave all of her life and all of her love into her gift. And Jesus said, that's why it's worth more than all the rest put together. The lesson that we can learn from that, I think, is very similar to the lesson that Mark's original readers and hearers received back in the 1st century. Imagine what it would have been like to have been living 12, 15, 20 years after Jesus died and rose from the dead and ascended up to heaven, and you were one of his followers. Now, Jesus was somebody that you may have actually seen and talked to. But he was alive when you were alive, and you have decided to follow him. One of the things we know about the followers of Jesus in the early decades after his death and resurrection is that many of them were poor. And so most of them probably identified with the one poor widow much more than they identified with all the rich political and religious leaders. And they must have been thinking, when Mark was telling the story about Jesus, I totally know how she must have felt. When you've got all these people giving all this money and making such a big deal about it, and then to go up and just put in that tiny little bit that I have, just has never felt like very much. So imagine what it must have been like when they heard the story that that little bit that people like them were able to give was worth all the rest because they put all of their life and all of their love into the gift. That's the lesson. As I said about the Gospel of Mark, the whole purpose Mark wrote the Gospel was to tell stories of Jesus in order to provide spiritual lessons. Well, we know the lesson now for the people that heard the Gospel of Mark. But what might the lesson be for us today? I think the lesson is very much the same. When we put all of our life, all of our living, and all of our love into the gift, that gift is of supreme value to God. It doesn't matter who you are or how much money you have. When you put your life into the gift, when you put your love into the gift, that gift is so valuable to God. So I leave you today with an invitation. But first of all, let me tell you about the story of Christopher and wrap that up. The reason I knew about the story of Christopher is I happened to be the capital campaign consultant at his church. And I'll never forget the day when his dad invited me to sit down with him. I think it was at the Dairy Queen in this little town just outside the reservation. And he told me the story of Christopher. And he told me just how much that meant to him and his wife. He was literally in tears. He was so moved by this gift of his son and the example that his son set for his wife and for him and for his whole family. In fact, for the entire church. What the father told me that day was that he and his wife wanted to give the entire amount of their gold to the church because they believed that that would help motivate everybody else to give at least that amount. And so that's exactly what he did. One Sunday, he got up in front of the whole congregation and shared about this amazing gift that 8-year-old Christopher gave to the church. And then he said, when we asked ourselves how that might translate into our lives, we decided to give the entire goal as a challenge to all of you to give at least that amount. Later, I went back to the church and found out that it worked. Little Christopher motivated his parents, and they motivated the entire congregation. And lo and behold, the amount of money that they raised in their capital campaign was more than double the entire goal that the pastor had set for them. And they were able to do not only the immediate things that they needed to do to keep the doors of the church open for a few years, but here it is 10 years later, and the doors of that church are still open, and that church is thriving out on the prairie of South Dakota, on that Indian reservation. And it all started with an 8-year-old boy who had a $20 bill. And I just have a feeling that whatever you have to give to God, or to give in any way to anyone, when you put yourself, your whole life, and your love into that gift, it is so very, very valuable. And so the invitation that I leave you with today is a question. Why not put your entire self, all of your living, and all of your love into every gift that you give? That's how God gives to us. For God so loved the world that God gave God's only Son. Thanks be to God.